Hi, everyone. Welcome and good evening. My name is Benjamin Quinn, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, the Harvard University Division of Science, and the Harvard Library, I'm so excited to introduce this virtual event with Frans de Waal presenting his book, Different: Gender Through the Eyes of a Primatologist. I hope you're all well and safe. Thank you for joining us virtually. This evening's event is the latest installment in our Harvard Science Book Talk series, which works to bring the authors of recently published science literature to our Cambridge community and beyond. On Monday, May 9th, we'll host pioneering neurobiologist W.A. Harris for a discussion of his book, Zero to Birth: How the Human Brain is Built, in conversation with Harvard's own Joshua Saines. To learn more about this and our other upcoming virtual events, you can visit harvard.com and sign up for our email newsletter, or check out the page harvard.com/science for more info. I'll also be posting a link to our Science Research Public Lectures channel in the chat, where you can view previous talks you might have missed. This evening's presentation will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our author at any point during the talk tonight, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen and we'll get through as many as time allows. In the chat, I'll be posting a link to purchase Different on harvard.com. Your purchases and financial contributions make events like tonight's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore. Thank you to our partners at Harvard University, and thank you all for showing up and tuning in support of authors, publishers, indie bookselling, and especially for science. And finally, as you have no doubt experienced in virtual gatherings, technical issues may arise. If any technical glitches do occur, we will do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. Thank you for your patience and understanding. Now it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Frans de Waal is a renowned primatologist, ethologist, and the C.H. Candler Professor Emeritus of Primate Behavior at Emory University, where he formerly directed the Living Link Center at the Yerkes National Primate Research Center. For 30 years, he has doggedly recorded his observations of primate behavior in countless beloved classics, including Chimpanzee Politics, Our Inner Ape, and the best-selling Mama's Last Hug. This evening, Frans, yet again, pulls from his decades of research and observation to bring us Different: a humorous, clear, and empathetic take on gender variation amongst primates and their human relatives, which Yuval Noah Harari calls a brilliant and fascinating book that brings a scientific, compassionate, and balanced approach to some of the hottest controversies about sex and gender. Peppered with details from his own life, including his own experience with the academic turf wars over outdated scientific theories that have proven hard, even and especially now, to dislodge from public discourse, Different is a fresh and thought-provoking approach to the long-running debate about the balance between nature and nurture, the limitations of the gender binary, and the exceptions who have always been here. We've got a lot to learn this evening, so without further ado, I'm delighted to turn things over to our speaker. Dr. de Waal has prepared for us a pre-recorded presentation, after which he will reconvene for a Q&A.
Hello, everyone. I'm here to give a lecture on gender and other primates. Now, I know it's a very controversial topic, and you may even wonder if the term gender should be applied to other primates. Maybe not. The reason I got involved in this topic is that each time in lectures, if I say that there's a sex difference in the primates, like let's say females are more empathic, males are more status-oriented and more violent, people zoom in on that. People want to know more about that. And I think because there's an intense curiosity about the origin of gender differences that we see in human society. Are they cultural or are they biological? Funny thing is, they're always both. There are maybe a few differences, superficial ones, like how long you wear your hair, or do you dress in pants or a dress. There are differences that, as a biologist, I don't care about, and I think they're fairly superficial. But there are other differences, such as what I mentioned, is the empathy, for example, that seem to be more ingrained. But even there, Culture has an effect, of course. Culture can enhance empathy in a society or suppress it, or enhance violence. You have very violent societies, or suppress it. You have societies where a murder is a very unusual occurrence because violence has almost entirely disappeared. So culture does have an effect even on that kind of differences. And that's why the term gender is very useful, because gender, that term relates to the cultural side of the sex differences that we see. And then you have complications in gender, of course, because gender is not nearly as simple as sex. Sex in biology is largely binary, not completely. I would say in humans, it's maybe 98% is binary, either male or female. But gender is more divided in masculine and feminine, and there's many forms in between. And the interesting thing for me is that we find that in other primates too. We find that same variability too. We see individuals, let's say you see males who are not into the macho games of impressing each other and don't participate. And you have females who are very masculine in their behavior. And so also in the other primates, the way sex is expressed or the way gender is expressed is very variable. So there's a lot to talk about because the connections are all very complex. And then in addition to that, I work with two species of primates that are our closest relatives, chimpanzees and bonobos. They're exactly equally close to us, but they're very different. And so chimpanzees are male-dominated and quite violent and territorial. Bonobos are female-dominated and have a lot more variation in their sexual behavior than most other species. And so I'm dealing with these two species that we can compare ourselves with, and I'm not going to choose between the two because I think they're both equally relevant. And so that makes for an interesting triangular comparison between these three species. And I think the term gender may actually also apply to other primates, because other primates develop very slowly. They learn a lot of things in their lifetime, including sex-typical behavior, which they pick up, the females usually from their mother, the males usually from high-ranking males around. And so even in the other primates, I would not exclude that we talk also about gender, because they are cultural beings. That's really an understanding that we have nowadays of animal behavior, is that there's a lot of social learning involved. And so it's not like you look at chimpanzees and bonobos and there you see the biological differences only. You see also cultural differences there. And so the comparison with humans is even more apt because we can also compare them in that regard. And so I like to make these comparisons, and I know it's not going to be a simple picture, and it's not going to be completely emphasizing biology, because I do believe that there's an enormous amount of flexibility in our species and also in other species. And I hope you enjoy the lecture. And then at the end, we will have hopefully a discussion about it. We have sex and gender. And sex usually refers to the biological side, the difference in genitals, chromosomes, hormones, the sexual dimorphism, which is visible in size and beard, breasts, and things like that. So that's the biological side, and it's largely, not completely, it's largely binary. But we have maybe 1 or 2% of individuals in humans who are not so easily classified due to genitals or chromosomes or their hormone profile. So they're not easily classified as male or female. And so the sexual binary is an approximation. Gender is a more complex concept because it's subject to culture. Gender roles are instilled by culture, education, socialization. They're different from place to place and from time to time. I would not divide gender in male and female. I would rather say it's masculine and feminine and everything in between, because some individuals combine these characteristics, of course. And so gender is a more flexible concept, like this baseball player. He feels that he needs to be taller than the woman. And so it has to do with expectations. And so it's quite a different concept than sex, even though nowadays many people use it actually to replace sex. They say, what's the gender of your dog? That's not a good question, because I don't think the dog is as subject to cultural expectations as we are. But we use the term now almost to replace sex, and that has created quite a bit of confusion. Since sex is more the biological side of the duality that we have, and gender more the cultural side, we usually divide it as nature and nurture. And these two always interact. There is no pure nature and there's no pure nurture. It's always a combination of the two that we see. The sexual dimorphism of our species is fairly small. It's like only 15% in size difference between male and female. The biggest difference is in upper body strength, which barely overlaps between the two sexes. I mean, men are far stronger, even untrained men compared to well-trained female athletes. Most of the men are stronger. I'm from a family, as you will see in the next picture, with a lot of sexual dimorphism, because I'm from a family of 6 boys. And here you have a picture of my mom with all her sons. We belong to a small group of primates without tails. The apes and the humans, or hominids, they are large, no tails, large brains, very intelligent. And that's the comparison I prefer. Monkeys are more distant from us. They're also relevant, they're also primates, but they're more distinct from us. And among the hominids, the closest to us are chimpanzees and bonobos, and I will mostly compare us with them. Chimps and bonobos are exactly equally close to us. We don't derive from them. We all derive from a common ancestor who lived about 6 million years ago. And no one knows exactly how that ancestor looked, whether it was chimp-like or bonobo-like or human-like or gorilla-like. We don't know, but we derive from a common ancestor. And so we're all very closely related. Chimps are on average a bit bigger and stronger than bonobos. Bonobos are more elegant. The sexual dimorphism in both chimps and bonobos is a bit larger than in our species, but not nearly as large as in some primate species where males can be twice the size of females, and that's clearly not the case in chimps and bonobos. Here we have the difference in size between male and female. The male is on the left in chimpanzees in real life. The male is not only bigger, but he also has more hair than the female. And when he displays or bluffs, he puts up all that hair and he looks even bigger than here in this picture. The reason we speak of gender in humans is, of course, partly because we are so slow in our development. It takes us 18 to 20 years to be fully grown. And in that time, we learn our sex roles. And so, yes, culture is a very important factor in our behavior. We often assume that that's maybe not the case with other animals. And we often say that their behavior is more instinctive. But what if they are also very slow? we usually consider chimpanzees or bonobos adults when they're 16. They have a very long nursing period. They're dependent also very long. And the reason they're so slow is, of course, and this is true for some other species like elephants and whales, is that they have to learn a lot of things before they are competent adults. And so they're in more or less the same situation as we are, is that the environment is going to have an enormous effect on their behavior. Babies nurse for about 4 or 5 years, so they actually have a longer nursing period than typical in our species. They can eat solid foods after about a year, but they remain dependent on breast milk, and they remain dependent on their mom. They travel with her all the time for the first 10 years. It's only when they reach adolescence that they become a bit more independent in their movements. So it's a very long dependency, and they remain small a very long time. So you may see a small bonobo and think that they're maybe a baby of 2, but they may be actually a baby of 5. We increasingly talk about culture in animals because groups of the same species may behave quite differently, and that's because they learn from each other. They learn, for example, tool techniques, like here the nut cracking by chimpanzees. They learn that from each other. You may have chimpanzees who have nuts and stones in the forest but don't do anything with them, and then you have other groups that have a long nut cracking tradition. So culture is a concept that we apply to animals increasingly, and not just to the primates, to all sorts of animals, also birds and whales and so on. And this whole idea that all animal behavior is inborn is really not very popular anymore. We also barely speak about instincts anymore, because animals, certainly slow developing animals like the apes, they learn an enormous amount of things in their lifetime. A study on wild chimpanzees found that daughters copy the exact termite fishing technique of their mom, the same tools, the same lengths of tools, the same movements, whereas the sons didn't. And that may be because the daughters are watching their mom more closely when they are fishing for termites. And there are several other studies in other primates as well that indicate that daughters copy their mom, sons may be more influenced by males that are around. And this relates to the issue of what I call self-socialization, is that young primates, and I think the same applies to boys and girls in human society, they identify more with members of their own gender and they copy them more closely. Young males like to hang around males and copy their movements, and young females like to hang around females. And so automatically they learn part of their sex roles from copying the behavior of adults of the same gender. And if that's the case, then we should probably also talk about gender in the primates, because it means that they learn their sex roles to some degree from each other. Each individual is different, and this also relates to gender diversity in the primates. Is you find all sorts of individuals. You find, for example, males who don't play the status game and don't try to reach the top spots, and they stay out of all confrontations, even though they may be very big males who have no trouble defending themselves, so they don't sink to the bottom of the hierarchy, but they are not into that kind of behavior. Or you have females who are very masculine in their behavior, and who act differently than other females. And so in this case, for example, Donna is a very interesting female, very nice female that we had in a group at the Turkish Primate Center. She was clearly a female in terms of her genitals, but she was built like a male. She had the long hair of a male. She would hang out with the males. And she acted often like a male. And if you didn't know From a distance, you would probably think that you were looking at a male. So she was sort of gender non-conforming in her behavior. And we have all these individuals that are a bit different from each other. And I would say the same gender diversity that we see in human society, to some degree, we see that also in the societies of other primates. Now, you may ask if Donna is perhaps transgender. In humans, transgender refers to people who are born as one sex. Let's say they're born as a male, but they identify as the other. They identify as a female. And in humans, we can talk about that because people can tell us how they identify, how they feel, that they're a girl or a boy. But with Donna, I cannot have that kind of discussion. And so I don't know if she was transgender or how she identified. All I know is her behavior. And I usually call her gender non-conforming, even though she could also fit the definition of transgender. Of our two closest relatives, the chimpanzee is male dominated, is quite aggressive. The males dominate the females very clearly, but also they're constantly busy trying to dominate each other and have strategies for that and have political alliances for that. And so here you have, for example, a male on the left who's the dominant male and the one on the right. They're actually the same size, but the one on the left makes himself look bigger and has a big piece of wood in his hand and intimidates the other. And that is something that male chimpanzees do all the time. You see a female on the left who is pant grunting, which is a submissive vocalization to a high-ranking male who approaches with all his hair up and intimidates and displays. And that's a typical situation in the forest. What you saw the male do is what we call a bipedal swagger. They walk on two legs, they spread their arms, they emphasize their shoulders, they look big and intimidating. It's of course a posture that we also know of dominant human males. What I like about this picture, apart from the posture of the president, is the two older men who are standing by his side and are supporting him. And that's such a typical chimp situation also. In chimpanzees, the older males, they are not necessarily the alpha male anymore, but they're very much involved in the politics, and behind the scenes, they sometimes have more power than the alpha male himself. This is a typical chimp situation where you have in the center the alpha male, but he's grooming an older male who's twice his age. The older male is his supporter, is the one who made him alpha male. And so you can imagine that that older male has an enormous amount of power, because if he withdraws his support, the young male is not alpha anymore, because the male on the right that you see sitting there is individually the strongest of the three males, but he has been deposed by the coalition. So that's chimpanzee politics right there. And it's very complicated. And it's very similar to what we see in humans, I would say. Male chimpanzees are quite territorial. On the left, you see a picture of a patrol. They patrol the borders of their territory. Sometimes they make excursions into the territory of their neighbors, and they may try to kill one of the males of the neighbors. It is something that has been reported now many times from Africa, and so that's a behavior that is typical of chimpanzees. The bonobo is a very different character from the chimpanzee. One of the things is the voice is much higher. You hear the high-pitched voice that they have. They are slightly smaller than the chimpanzee, but it is especially their social life that is very different from the chimps. Even though genetically chimpanzees and bonobos are exactly equally close or equally distant from us, anatomically, the bonobo looks more like one of our ancestors, more like Australopithecus. And that is because of their long legs, and especially when they stand upright, as in this case, a female on the left and a male on the right, they look extremely human-like, much more so than the chimpanzee. Bonobos are known for their rich sex life. They have sex in all combinations of individuals, male, 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 female, 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 adults with juveniles, all sorts of combinations. And they have all sorts of positions. This is a male here mating with a female, belly to belly, which is actually quite a common position. But you also have all sorts of variations on this. I don't know any bonobo group, either in captivity or in the wild, that is led by a male. They're always led by a female, sometimes several females. And this female here, Princess Mimi of the Sanctuary of Bonobos, with Claudine Andre, the founder of the sanctuary. Mimi was very clearly the alpha female and had a coalition of other females who supported her, which I think is the typical situation in bonobos. And males may be high ranking, but usually below the top. Perhaps under the influence of the females, the bonobos are also far less territorial and less violent than chimpanzees. So until now, we don't have any confirmed reports of one bonobo killing another one in the wild or in captivity. That's a very, very big difference with chimpanzees. And also when groups meet, that's usually arranged by the females. There may be some hostility, but much of the time there's also what we call mingling between groups. And here you see a whole number of females and their young of 3 different groups who get together and socialize, which is unheard of in the chimpanzee. In the chimpanzee, this never happens because there's only hostility between groups. The idea that people have about primates as being led by a male dictator who owns the females and decides everything, and the females are only there to make babies for him. That view is 100 years old and goes back to a early baboon study in a zoo, Hamadryas baboons. And yes, the Hamadryas baboon is maybe a feminist nightmare. And also the males are twice the size of females in that species. They are monkeys, they're quite distant from us. And it's unfortunate that these baboon studies have colored the perception of the general public about gender relationships. Because I think if we look at the apes, especially if we look at both chimpanzees and bonobos, we get a very different picture of the relation between the genders. Even in a species like the chimpanzee, where the males are clearly dominant over the females, these males do more than just dominate. They're not just terrorizing everyone, intimidating everyone. Here you have the alpha male in the center who is stopping a fight between two females. Female on the left, female on the right are fighting over food. He steps in and stands between them and stops the fight. And that's one of the main roles that high-ranking males have, is to keep the peace in the group and keep the group together. So they're unifiers usually and peacemakers. And yes, they are on top and they have certain privileges, but they also have certain obligations. High-ranking males even interfere in the smallest fights, like between juveniles, and that's because a fight between young chimps can escalate to fights between their mothers, and so they stop them right away.
Where there's a fight, Nicky intervenes. That's part of his job as leader. Jonah is fighting Walter, but Jerome, the second man, is on his way. Chastises Walter.
In the wild, high-ranking males may act as traffic guards. So they take a position in the middle of the road, stopping the traffic. Look at the villagers in the background. And he will wait till the entire group has crossed the road. And he waits patiently till they do that. And you will see that he only leaves the road when the last ones have crossed. Well, this is just to indicate that high-ranking males in a male-dominated species like the chimpanzee, they're much more than bullies. People always imagine that they terrorize everyone and that's all they do, but they also have certain responsibilities and they keep the peace. And actually experiments indicate that if you remove these high-ranking individuals, then you get a very chaotic situation and it's very hard to find peace in that situation. People discuss toys for their sons and their daughters as if they are completely in charge of the choice, which is really not true because studies indicate that parental attitudes have actually very little effect on the toys that children like to play with. And the doll is one of the oldest toys archaeologists find. Is dolls have always been around and probably always been played with by girls more than by boys. Primates show a strong attraction to dolls, mostly females who are attracted to them. In captivity, if you give them dolls, they will carry them and hold them, sometimes even try to nurse them, holding them against their nipple, putting them on their back, walking around with them. In the wild, chimpanzees have been found to pick up rocks and logs and carry them as if they're carrying an infant, putting them on their back, sometimes even building a nest for them. And so there seems to be in the apes a strong attraction to playing with dolls, which relates probably to their future as mothers of caring for infants. And the primates are extremely attracted to infants, especially the females. Here you see a graph on the handling and holding of infants in a group of macaques. And not surprisingly, among the adults, it's mostly the females who do this. These are the mothers who have their own infants. But now look at the young macaques who are not adult yet and have not their own infants, but still the females are doing far more of infant handling than males do. And that's because they're very attracted to babies, and young females will surround a new mother to try to get their hands on her baby. That's really what they want to do. And the males are much less interested in that. The interest of young females in infants translates into babysitting. So that gives mothers a reprieve. They can go groom with their friends, and the young females will take care of their babies. And they're very careful with them, much more careful than young males are.
Mothers set up a baby and toddler group in a quiet part of the temple. But looking after baby is a full-time occupation. So once they are 3 weeks old, if mom wants a break, she has a solution. Employ a teenage babysitter. As these young females develop feelings of love and care, they just want to hold a baby. It's an arrangement that gives the moms a break, a chance to be pampered and groomed.
In the apes, the mothers are less trusting and keep an eye on things. This is a young female who has kidnapped the baby from her mom, a sibling. And her mother, as you will see, is going to follow her, keeping an eye on the situation. But the young females are very attracted to babies and want to carry them. So that's her sister, and this is her mother, who is following from a distance. What do young males do in the time that the females are hanging around mothers to touch their infants and hold dolls and things like that? The males are mostly roughhousing. Males are very much, young males love to wrestle and run around and fight with each other, mock fights, or like in this case, a young male who's testing his strengths on an adolescent who's a little bit bigger and stronger. That's what they love to do. And this tendency of rough and tumble play, as we call it, is of course also very common in humans, and in humans also universally, boys play more like that than girls. Apart from typical behavior for males and females, I'm very interested in the potentials, things that they don't always do or that you don't always see, but that they can do. And I'll show you 2 examples of it. First of all, there's female leadership. So even in a species like the chimpanzee, where the males dominate, you may have a female leader like Mama, the chimpanzee, who is absolutely central and arranges a lot of things in society. I always make a distinction between dominance and power. You can be dominant, but that doesn't mean that you're the most powerful. And Mama was extremely powerful, a very central figure in the group. And that's why she became a subject of my previous book, Mama's Last Hug. And then, of course, we have bonobo society, where the alpha individual is a female. And female dominance in the bonobos is a collective dominance. Collectively, the females dominate the males. Individually, they are smaller than males, and they would not be able to do that. But high-ranking female bonobos have a very powerful position and very central to the group. One of the things that high-ranking females, for example, in chimpanzee society often do is mediate reconciliation. So for example, Mama, the chimpanzee, was extremely good at that. If males had a fight here, you have two males who are sitting opposite each other. They're not reconciling after the fight as they usually would do. They're sort of grumpy about it. And then Mama would come in and bring these two males together. She would even pull at the arm of one male to get him to sit next to the other one, to get them to groom each other. And so these mediations in peaceful resolutions of conflict are a typical female strategy, and high-ranking females are very good at that. Another potential I want to mention is the nurturant tendencies of males. Usually you don't get to see them because females take care of the young and the males do actually quite little. But sometimes a female loses her life, and so all of a sudden there's an orphan. No one is taking care of the orphan, and sometimes males step in and do that. Here you have an older brother, 17 years old on the left, so a young adult who lost his mother, and his sibling also, of course, lost his mother. And so he adopted the younger brother, and they travel together. He protects the young one. He may sleep with him in the nest. And so he becomes really the caretaker of the young. And he can do that because the young one has been weaned at this point. In Thai forest, in Ivory Coast, several adoptions have been observed by high-ranking males, sometimes alpha males, who adopt an orphan, travel with them, protect them, and show that adult males are perfectly capable of taking care of the young ones. They normally don't do this, but it's a potential that they clearly have.
Freddie took to parenting very naturally. He patiently taught Oscar the skills of the forest, things he should have learned from his own mother. With a new parent like Freddie, Oscar blossomed.
Every day was like a voyage of discovery about what we would see next. And the relationship just became more and more special as we became much more familiar with those two characters.
Well, in this lecture, I've gone over what is gender, what is sex, how are they different, how are they connected, and also the idea that since apes develop so slowly and have so many influences on their behavior, that maybe the term gender can be used for them as well, in the sense that there is a big learning component to their sex roles. There are sex differences in behavior, such as the interest of young females in infants, or the interest of young males in roughhousing, and there's all sorts of other differences. So there are sex differences, but there's also an enormous influence of the environment. And there are certain potentials that we see that are not always expressed, but that show that both sexes are capable of behavior that you don't always get to see, but are perfectly capable of. My book on gender treats the issue, of course, in a lot more detail than what I can do in a lecture like this. And I would say almost half of the book is about the human species, and the other half is about the comparison with our primate relatives. And so if you're interested in that topic, I recommend that you read the book. I took this Matisse painting on the cover because it shows men and women without all the cultural overlays of how we dress and how we wear our hair and how we act, just men and women dancing together the way they are. And I thought that was the most appropriate picture. And I thank you for your attention. to this lecture.
Frans, I believe you're with us now.
Yes, I am. I have a picture also. There we are. Yeah.
Great, yeah.
Hi.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Frans, again for providing us with that wonderful presentation. We have a few questions in the Q&A, so let's go through those. Sorry, just going.
Do I get to see the people who ask questions or not? Yeah.
They unfortunately you won't be able to see them, but they are all here in spirit and they are here in their questions. So I'll start with this question from an attendee who asks, why haven't other species, including humans, learned from bonobos and operated in a female-dominated manner? It seems more evolutionary beneficial, if nothing else.
I'm not sure it's evolutionarily beneficial. For the bonobos, I'm sure it is. Otherwise, they wouldn't be doing it. But the fact that other species, like most monkeys and chimpanzees, don't have that kind of society is probably an adaptation to where they live, and maybe it's better not to have it there. I think if you look at our two closest relatives, chimpanzees and bonobos, there is actually a little bit of overlap between their tendencies, in the sense that we know that, for example, in West Africa, most of the data you see are on chimps in East Africa, where there's a lot of violence and so on. But in West Africa, we know that the chimpanzees live closer together, a bit like bonobos, which allows the females to be together, which makes them more powerful. And so in these West African communities, I think there's more of a balance, not entirely, but there's more of a balance between males and females than in the other ones. And so all of this has to do with what is the best social system to have under certain ecological circumstances. And bonobos may seem to some people the absolute ideal, but I don't think that's how evolution necessarily works. Evolution works with what is the best for your survival and reproduction, you know?
Great. So we have a couple different questions about gender and sexual variation. So I'm just going to go through those a bit. So Laura Miner, who cites, you mentioned that there's a 1 or 2% of chimps who are neither male nor female, and she wants to know what happens to them, or sort of what becomes of them in their society.
Well, I'm not sure they're neither male nor female. You mean intersexual individuals? I'm sure they exist. We know very little about it. I was emphasizing individuals who have one sex, like Donna, who clearly is of the female sex when she was born, but who act differently, who don't fit the role necessarily of a female and act more masculine. And I think intersexual individuals, I'm sure they occur. The strange thing is that in primatology, we pay very little attention to this. We like to come with stories of the typical male does this and the typical female does that. We like to work with averages. And I think the same is true for human society, by the way, is that for a long time we have overlooked people who are non-binary, or we have even overlooked people who have a different sexual orientation because we didn't want to deal with all that. And so I think in primatology, we need to start paying more attention to this variation that exists. But we don't have a lot of data on it. And so I have, in my book, I've related a few examples, but I'm sure that if we start looking for it, we will find many more.
And then we have another question that's sort of similarly about gender variation. So an attendee asks, do we see variation in treatment of gender nonconformity in primates among different groups? I.e. chimp group 1 has less gender behavior variation than chimp group 2, and maybe because that group 1 is less accepting than group 2. Are there any cultural elements specific to different groups within the same species that can be identified?
It's very likely. I cannot for sure say that that's the case, but we do find a lot of cultural variability between chimp groups in how they behave and how aggressive they are and how dominance is expressed. So I'm sure that exists. But, in general, I would say, I'm not sure I mentioned that in the lecture, but Donna, for example, the chimpanzee, was extremely well integrated and well accepted in our group. And in general, we see no rejection of these kinds of individuals. The only kind of rejection that I could imagine in a primate group is if someone disturbs the peace, if someone bothers them. Yes, I would imagine that they might ostracize such an individual. But in general, individuals who don't follow the main pattern, so to speak, in terms of gender expression or sexual orientation, I've never noticed that they make a big fuss about that. That's just how that individual is. And I think one of the differences in the human species is that we are a symbolic species. So we label things. We like to put labels on everything. You're a man, you're a woman, you're heterosexual, you're homosexual. We have labels for everything. And that doesn't help. I think it doesn't help integrate individuals who don't fit these pigeonholes. And so I think the human species has a lot of trouble with that, partly because of the labeling, partly because we have certain standards of behavior that I don't think the chimpanzees have to that degree. We have certain standards of behavior and we feel everyone needs to conform to those standards.
You brought up Donna, and I just want to ask this question from an attendee who asks, did Donna have any other biological sex markers, i.e. different hormone levels, genetic differences that you were able to observe?
Yeah, unfortunately, we never looked at that. And so we treated Donna we gave her iron pills when she was menstruating because she clearly had anemia. And so she had a lot of trouble, I think. Her sexual swellings were never fully swollen, so she may also have been hormonally different. She was not interested in sex. She did not have sex with, for example, females, because you might think that she was lesbian or something, but I think she was basically uninterested. She also never had children. So we don't know exactly where this comes from in Donna. And not all of these gender variations have necessarily a hormonal basis, but it's very well possible that it had in her case, you know.
So we have another question in the queue that's sort of about if your book kind of ventures into the human side of things. So Rimana Souza asks, thanks for the beautiful talk. What do you think is the origin of discriminatory behavior or attitude in humans against different gender or sexual orientation?
Yeah, I think you have to ask that a sociologist or a psychologist, because of course, people often attribute it to religion, but I'm not sure that that's necessarily the main explanation, because religion could also be tolerant. I think religion reflects how society looks at things. And there are, after all, there are languages and cultures where there's room for a third gender, where it's recognized. So I'm not sure that religion is the origin. I don't know where the intolerance comes from. Culture is certainly a factor. I'm from a country myself where these issues are less sharply defined as in the United States. So for example, when I came to the US in the 1980s, I came as an immigrant and I had to fill out a piece of paper that I was not a communist and not a homosexual. I had to fill that out. So for me, this was astonishing because I'm from a country where homosexual love has been legal for more than 2 centuries. I'd never heard that it could be forbidden. But so by culture, this is different. And the American culture is pretty Puritan and pretty strict on these issues compared to many other cultures. So I don't know where that comes from. Is that religion in the US or is it something else? I don't know where that comes from.
So unfortunately, we just have time for a few more questions, so I'm going to pivot to this next one because we have a lot of people asking about gender variation and what it kind of means, across species. And so someone just asks a question simply, do you think there are non-binary primates, are people, are species kind of having sort of variations that may sort of resemble human variations? I myself am non-binary, so I'm also curious to see what your stance on that is.
Yeah, I think if we start looking for it, we haven't really done that in primatology. We're gonna find more variation than you would normally assume. It may not be as much as in human society, because I think humans are quite variable. But we in biology, we are very used to variation. Of course, you take two trees in the forest of the same species, and they're going to be different trees. And in biology, we know that variability is built into the system, individual variability. And so we're not surprised by variability, but society has a lot of trouble with it. I think if we start looking for it in other primates, we will find more homosexual behavior than we have thus far reported, because people have been shy about reporting that, I think. And we will find more gender variability. And how we interpret that, whether we consider it biological variation or whether there's also a level of cultural variability, as in human society, where some people don't want to express their gender or refuse to fit one box or the other. That will be up to us to find that out, how it works. But I think there is an enormous degree of variability, and we need to get used to that. The thing is that of course, if we start speaking of gender in the primates, not just sex, biological sex, but also gender, then it becomes a very different way of looking at things, because gender, in my view, is more expressed in masculine, feminine, and everything in between. And if we're going to talk about gender in the other primates, we're going to find an enormous range of variabilities.
Okay, so I think we have time for two more questions. I'm going to ask this sort of more biological question from Kevin Dennelsbeck in the audience, who asks, do gender differences correlate with the size differences of dimorphic species with bigger divides, such as gorillas?
Yeah, I think the bigger the difference, the gender difference in size is, the more obvious it is that the males, if the males are the bigger ones, are going to be dominant. So that's why that early baboon study, where the size difference is so humongous, was not the best way to start the discussion about gender in the primates. But the size difference between males and females has more to do with competition between males than with the need for males to dominate females. There is no need for males to dominate females. There is a need for males to outcompete other males. And that's why, for example, in these baboons or in the gorillas, the males are so huge compared to females. That's driven by male competition. It's not driven by the need to be dominant over females. That's the secondary issue for them.
Wonderful. So I'm going to end with this sort of general question from the queue, which is, your book encompasses so many different kinds of data, so many different kinds of conversation. Was there anything that didn't make it into this book that you really wish had made it into the final product?
Yeah, I left out everything that doesn't relate to primate behavior. So, for example, we have economic inequality in our society, which I find interesting. I find it interesting that economists have decided, for some reason, or society has decided, that household work doesn't pay. You pay people for work in public, in the public sphere. You don't pay people for household work or domestic work. And I don't know why our society has decided that. And so that kind of issues of income inequality and certain decisions of how we set up our society, I don't discuss, but I'm very intrigued by that. Is that how we ever decided to do it that way?
Wonderful. So that is all the time we have for questions, unfortunately. Thank you to everyone in the queue. Frans, before we sign off, any last minute words for our audience?
No, I think read the book if you want to have more detail, because there's a lot more detail than in my lecture is pretty superficial compared to that.
Yeah, wonderful.
Thank you for your attention. Yeah.
Of course. And thank you again for joining us. I put the link in the chat to purchase the book a couple times, but I just wanted to let everyone know that thank you for joining us. Thanks for spending part of your evening with us. Please learn more about this book and purchase Different at harvard.com. On behalf of Harvard Bookstore, the Harvard University Division of Science, and the Harvard Library, all here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, enjoy the rest of your evening. Keep reading and be well. Thank you so much, Frans.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Bye.